Good evening, Internet tough guys. Today we'll be talking about the county level inequality in the USA. Specifically, we're looking at the ability of race or racial demographics or ethnicity, these sort of things, versus climate to explain inequality. And here we're chiefly interested in cognitive inequality or intelligence. And the background for this talk is this paper that you may pause to read. But essentially, here's what we're doing. In the USA, they have many states of which lots of research is done. The problem with states is there's only 50 of them and 51 if you include the quasi-state of Washington, D.C. And so that gives you a very limited ability or precision in your models, since usually you want some regression model that you will want more than one explanatory factor. And when your sample size is 50, this ain't going to go very well, and you're probably going to get some useless results, or very p-hacked ones. Anyway, the solution for that is to zoom more in, and in the US this is possible because there are also counties. Counties are hierarchically a subset of states, so every county is in exactly one state, and there's 3,100 or so of these, and it changes every year since some split and some merge, and this sort of thing. Anyway, so no one has given an IQ test to every single county. Well, actually that is not true, but at the time of writing this paper, no one had done so. At least we were not aware of a data set. And nevertheless, there is a data set. It's based on scholastic ability, so it's testing on kids doing school, standardized tests. And since every state, more or less, has its own test, these have to be then put on the same scale, and that can be done using the NEAP, a National Educational Progress Achievement or something like that, and that is given to every state. And since you can then correlate that inside every state with the state test, that means you can link them through this other test, and maybe they have some items in common. Anyway, at Stanford there are some nice people who have done this, and it's called the Stanford Education Data Archive, which is totally free to download and has all this data. And if you plot that, you get this plot. Where blue is good and red is bad, and we can see basically here where the Africans live is not good. And if you're wondering about these dots, I believe these are Indian reservations, and possibly some of these are these, and the like blue spots like this is probably like some city somewhere or another. That's pretty much roughly what you can deduce, and generally speaking the northern ones are a bit smarter. This, of course, you can download the data and play for yourself. We also need something other to relate stuff to. Here we have, so socioeconomic status is some like component of income and education and this sort of thing. So you take these measures of social status and you correlate them, and they correlate very highly. You essentially take a weighted average of these, where the weight depends on how strongly they are correlated to the other ones. So the S factor loading. Anyway, so you get this map, which looks quite like this map. And so unsurprisingly, these two are strongly correlated. If we then look at the UV variation, we get this sort of map, and here I've standardized the data, since most of you are not really interested in, say, the watt per square meter or whatever it is we're measuring this, the UV radiation in. Anyway, it looks like this. Down here we have a lot of sun in the southwest, and in the north we have less sun, but it's not exactly just linked to latitude, because for instance down here we have more sun than, or we have less sun than up here. And so we can kind of go here where they have tons of sun compared to down here, even though this one is a lot further north. Anyway, there is a nice amount of variation, and up here is terrible. Sorry, Washington. Anyway, so mainstreamers, naturally, they have sort of looked at these things, and they have this field called latitudinal psychology, or this topic, and we have these typical mainstreamers, Wendy Vliert, I guess he's Dutch, and Van Lange, or Van Lange. And they have also noticed that when you do plots like this, you relate countries, and you take the latitude, and you take any nice thing on the y-axis. Here they have creativity, whatever that is here. Maybe it's like patents or something. And here we have aggressiveness, which is probably like a murder rate. And you can see that there's essentially, you don't want to be around the equator, and you want to be like north. And that's, will not surprise many people who've looked at the world map of these things, right? Human problems are clustered among the equator. And so these normal people, they spend a lot of time doing this sort of plot and not a lot of time understanding why it is there. However, and I mean, okay, one thing first. These sort of people, they don't like us. They don't want to talk about any race or IQ stuff. Anyway, Federico here, he wants to play fair. He wants to play nice and standard academic. And of course, in the proper academic way, according to Merton, you have to have this public debate of ideas, and everybody will scrutinize each other, and everybody is kind of having a nice time debating ideas. And Federico here, he has been doing this even in the Mankind Quarterly, and I believe by my suggestion, they had a special issue on his theory, and there were some other people who replied to that with some other data, and Carl had the UK data. The UK data, you can imagine the smarter people in the south, and so actually closer to UV, that's the opposite of his theory, that the more UV should make you dumber, basically. Anyway, and he gets published in this journal too. So he's actually been publishing this sort of stuff for a while, and that's why we were like happy to debate him, or shall we say engage with his idea, since he's been playing nicely and doing the way you're supposed to do science, which is publish and critique each other's paper. Anyway, so to sum things up in causal terms, here we have everybody seems to agree that latitude is important in some causal sense. Over here we have the normal mainstream people. Those are the ones who believe in magic dirt and magic extractive institutions and all these other magic things that somehow magically appear to go wherever the Europeans are. Down here we have Federico and Team Serious researchers over here. And so we both think UV radiation is kind of important. And over here we think it's related to intelligence, because UV radiation, well, lack of it makes it quite difficult to survive in regions in the winter, and so you have to have foresight and store food and blah 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 and build fire, clothing, and all this stuff is not so easy, and that tends to select for intelligence in many animals, not just humans, and this eventually leads to genetic differences that are related to intelligence and so on, and then you get the kind of the wealth of nations that we have nowadays. To simplify his model, he has advanced a few default causal patterns, but a typical one that he says has to do, for instance, with vitamin D. UV radiation gives you more vitamin D, and vitamin D makes your hormones go up, and then you have more sexy time. And when you have more sexy time, you have more kids. And when you have more kids, you're investing fewer resources in each kid. So he's using an old economist model of such, and he gets its own pathway that when you then invest fewer resources in these kids, they turn out to be less intelligent, and that is then you get this kind of positive feedback, and that eventually leads to the wealth of nations. And so we both agree that climate is important, but we think it's through genetics, and he thinks it's through direct hormone. So these are all climate models, and these are the boohoo non-climate people. Anyway, so the purpose of our study, quite simple. Federico, he has published studies where he took the US states and he took the UV stuff, and I forgot to put the slide here, but essentially if you put that in regression, then Federico seems to be right. He seems to be that race doesn't predict so much IQs and stuff, but UV does. And since, as I said in the beginning, there's only 50 states and you have correlated predictors and stuff, these conclusions are going to be very uncertain, and you can get weird aggregation effects when you aggregate because of the non-randomness of state boundaries or county state boundaries and county boundaries and this sort of thing. Anyway, so here we do a new thing. We look at the counties, which are much more numerous, allowing us much more statistical prediction or precision. And furthermore, we have a cool thing. We can split the data by race or sire, and sire means self-identified race or ethnicity. And of course, if you're only looking at white people, your results can't really easily be due to not controlling for black people properly, since you're only looking at white people. You would have to say some kind of second order effect, whereas the presence of like non-whites depresses the white scores or something like that. Anyway, that is kind of remotely plausible or less likely, but here it's still nice and unconfounded by design. Anyway, so the main correlations, the whatever CA means cognitive ability, and because we didn't exactly use an IQ test here, it's a scholastic ability test, so it's tilted towards schoolwork, but it will correlate something like 0.8 or so with intelligence, so it's almost an intelligence test like the SAT, but not quite an intelligence test. Anyway, so what we see is that I think we need above the diagonal, so if we go cognitive ability with the socioeconomic status, that's correlated 0.3, and that's of course that these two maps look very similar. Right? So the correlation is very high, and that's what we looked at in our prior study, also with this data set. I think it's from 2006. There was one more prior study there. It's also true if you look at the different races. So, for instance, the cognitive ability and the I guess they didn't provide the social status of Asians. Anyway, okay, so we look at the cognitive ability of blacks, and it will correlate 0.4 or so with the socioeconomic status of blacks, which is also quite good. But the thing is that the black socioeconomic status is heavily affected by amount of money they can get from white people or Asians living in the same place, and that's why the correlation is weaker. Also, the black percent does not vary so much. And anyway, longer section. Anyway, we see that there's for the purpose of this study, the ones that are important is the UV ones over here. Can we make this nicer? Yes, we can. And the UV ones say that you can see that the UV radiation is correlated negatively with intelligence. If we look at everybody, that's negative 0.33 here, which is a moderate correlation. And but within group, it doesn't correlate so much. Like Asians is only minus 0.07, and white people it's only minus 10, which is worse because it should actually be stronger for white people, considering that white skin makes you more susceptible to UV, and it should be weaker for blacks since black skin protects against it, but we get the opposite effect here. And when we look at the socioeconomic status stuff, it gets even worse, right? The things are now suddenly correlated the wrong direction. So I'm guessing that actually reflects that people who want to live in nicer places, they tend to buy it in house places, places with more sun and so on. Anyway, so the correlations are kind of not exactly where they're supposed to be for his theory. Nevertheless, we can go further and we can look at a regression model. And here we're looking at the data with everybody together. So here, everybody together here means that we take the average cognitive ability for each county, and then we try to predict that from all these other factors. And so we can see here, we just begin with the UV radiation. That 3.3 is the same number we got over here. So things are fine. What we then see is that here we just have the racial demographics insofar as we can get those. There's 4 groups here. And the reason the white one is missing is that you can't have every group at once, because then they sum to 1, and then your regression models, the math doesn't work out. Because you have this thing called perfect collinearity. Anyway, you can see immediately that race itself is a much better predictor, and you can see why down here in the UV alone, so including all the things that U is a proxy for, it has an R squared of 0.13.5, and the race ones is 0.42.6. So this is, approximately 3 times as important measured in the R square. And if you put them together, you can see that UV gets reduced by 2/3 or so, and the race stuff still strong. And you can see the UV does not add much to the model above race. So it adds about another 3% or so, and these are mostly unchanged, right? They get slightly weaker. Like the Amerindian declines 0.04, and like this one declines 0.04, and this one is 0.03, and this one actually goes up a little bit. Anyway, we can add some more predictors. We can try adding latitude or temperature. We can add latitude, longitude, elevation. Maybe these predict something important, but you can see the difference between these models is that though this one is better, it explains another 7% variance or so. The relative importance between these does not seem much changed. The most important factor in explaining the IQ of a given U.S. county is how many black people are there. And next after that, it's the Amerindians and the Hispanics and the Asians. Temperature stuff seems to be positive, which goes against, again, many results. For instance, there are some economists who had made a minor career out of claiming that you need to have more AC in the testing schoolrooms, and you can do some fancy stuff. You can find some buildings that had AC was shut off by electricity failure during the exam, and it didn't happen to the other building that was over there, and then you have this nice natural experiment. And if you have enough of these, you can get this kind of thing, or you can use like test scores over many years, and you can check whether the heat wave was in one place, and the years that it hasn't happened to be warmer in some county, that should be the same years that the test scores tend to be lower. Anyway, but what we see here is actually the correlation is positive, not negative. So you may wonder about that. And we also have longitude, which again stretches imagination to imagine that longitude itself should have some kind of cause on this, since that longitudes are totally arbitrary units that we've defined as a Greenwich is 0 or whatever, and then the other ones are just going west or east. And elevation, again, generally should be lower negatively because there's less oxygen in the air, and of course if you go far enough in the air people start fainting and so on. So if anything, like causally speaking, longitude shouldn't have any effect. Latitude probably shouldn't have any direct effect. Temperature should be negative, elevation should be negative, but both of these are positive. We can take a guess at why that is. It's probably because smarter people they want to live in a place with nicer water or nicer temperature, and they want to live in the mountains because mountains are pretty. So this is like if reflecting like the Colorado people or something like that. We can keep adding more controls. Over here we add the spatial lag, and the spatial lag is that if we take this map and we say we want to control for things that we haven't measured, but which are common between neighboring counties. So what we say is that we want to predict, for instance, this green county over here. I don't know. We want to predict the IQs of those kids, and we do that. We can do that by averaging the 3 closest counties, and that's our kind of guess from the neighbor countries. And this correlation of the spatial correlation here is very strong, maybe 0.8 or so. Anyway, so what it means is that you're trying to control the things that you haven't exactly looked at, but you think they're very similar in neighboring counties, and that could be anything that is shared, since pretty much everything of interest is shared between neighboring counties. This way is a clever way of controlling for things that you haven't measured. And we can see that even controlling for the other things, the average IQ of the counties still predicts stuff, but even controlling for that and all the other unmeasured things this correlates with, it doesn't change much these associations. It does make the model much better, right? Another 5% variance. We're getting to like 60% almost. This one, what we do here is we simply allow the UV effect to be nonlinear. So maybe a little bit UV doesn't do so much, but a lot tends to have a negative effect, or maybe a little bit is better than nothing. You could imagine some kind of nonlinear effects. Nevertheless, we see that moving between these two models, you get an estimated 0.1% variance explains. So it is, in other words, it's useless. There's no point in looking at nonlinear stuff. Finally, if we then try to model the effect here of the UV and then having different race groups, what you do then, you add an interaction effect, and if you do that, the model becomes slightly better, 2% or so. And strangely, like now the main effect of UV becomes positive, so it's better to have more of it, and strangely it becomes the coefficient here you have to add to this one to get the effect on blacks, so to say. And so that would be estimated much stronger for blacks, whereas it's supposed to be about 0 according to his theory, and the other ones kind of don't make a lot of sense. So generally speaking, this final model it wasn't much better than the previous one, and it didn't make a lot of sense. Totally does not make a lot of sense from the perspective of UV radiation models. And if you compute the average R2 that can kind of be attributed to these values, you can see that most of the model is attributed to that, and the other stuff is only, well, borderlines. And UV stuff essentially is contributing nothing, since it has a quite small beta and it's only one variable and so on. This is highly correlated with the other ones. So it basically does not look very good for Federico's model. And we can do this again, and instead of looking at the IQ here, we're looking at the social status. And so that's this map, right? We're now trying to explain this map, but since it correlated 0.7 with the first map, this doesn't change much. Here's the factor loadings, as I was talking about earlier, that you see the correlation it's very high, like median income in some counties super highly correlated with the unemployment, adults negatively, obviously, and household poverty rate and these sort of things. And anyway, so we get a very similar pattern, except UV is now positive, as we kind of found before. That seems to go against Federico's model, but not exactly, since his model was about intelligence, and he could say that maybe UV makes people work harder or something, although that doesn't seem to be the case either. Race, however, keeps being a quite good predictor. The best predictor in terms of the standardized beta is, again, the black proportion. If you don't know anything else, then just guess about the black proportion. And if you want to guess more, then use the Hispanics and the Asians. Or not Hispanics, sorry, the Amerindians. Latitude, some other stuff is good. Now temperature is actually 0, which is strange because here it was quite strong, even 0.30 or so. Now it becomes very small over here, and here it's a non-significant temperature. And then latitude still positive, and longitude is now much weaker. Elevation doesn't seem to do much, so I guess it's not very consistent with the rich people move to Colorado. Somehow smart people move to elevated areas, but I don't really know why you get this this difference. This is supposed to say S-lag. It says CA-lag, and I guess that's because John, he fucked up when he filled in the table in the paper. Again, these the interactions, they don't make a lot of sense. Why it should be a bit weaker among Hispanics, but still positive, right? Remember, you have to take the 41, subtract this, so you get 32 or so, and that would be among Hispanics. So why that makes sense when this one is, I don't know. It doesn't like it makes no any sense. It makes no sense in a climate model. From a race perspective, though, these things make a lot of sense. Now come the cooler part. Instead of looking at the average IQ of some county, we can look at the average IQ, but only of white students or black students or Hispanic students or Asian students. There is not enough data for the Native Americans since they're mostly they're mostly concentrated in a few counties. And anyway, we do this and we look at the UV stuff and we get, it's not much better than before. It's supposed to be most consistent for the white one, but remember it's supposed to be negative, and in fact the strongest, well, not the second strongest correlation or beta you get here is the positive beta for whites in the second model, and that's the one we didn't adjust for things that we haven't measured, and when we adjust for things we haven't measured with this CA lag, then it becomes nothing. So it's totally totally not in line with what you should think with his model, and we can see that mostly things that we haven't measured are the important ones because the model this one does not explain very much variance. You can see it's about 40% or so you can explain when you're guessing from the neighbor states of white people or neighbor counties with white people, and when you're not doing that, you can only predict 4%. So whatever these factors, they're not measuring something that seems to be very important for the differences between IQs between white or counties. With blacks, you can see UV doesn't do much of anything in any case. We still get some weird stuff of longitude, and again, it's just guess from the neighbors. If we look at Hispanics, it becomes negative, as it should be by his theory. It's weird why Hispanics would be more negative than the white one, right? Since Hispanics have a bit darker skin, because they have some maybe 50% or so non-European ancestry, it should be weaker. This slope should be closer to 0 than the white one, but since the white one is 0, 0, and 0.3, that it makes not a lot of sense. Asians, again, it varies. It's not quite clear how these findings make any sense in his model. Finally, we can look at another thing. We can look at the gap sizes, and in each county, you can of course take the average white score and the average other non-white score, and you can compute the gap between these. And the gap between them will be this column here. The D is the gap, the delta, and the BV means black white, and the HV is Hispanic white. They did not give the gaps for the Asian and whites for whatever reason, and so we can't use those. Or maybe we didn't plot them in this table. But there's one of them that's missing somewhere. Anyway, what we get is that counties with larger black and white gaps are the ones with fewer blacks in them, and the ones with more whites in them. No, this the ability of blacks and the ability of the whites makes sense. But it's not related to the UV, right? And it actually should be related to the UV because the UV stress, according to his model, which remember is UV stress through skin, and since white people have white skin, they're kind of protected or unprotected from the UV radiation, and thus should be under stronger effects of this climatical factor or this environmental factor. And so essentially the places with a lot of sun, the white should be relatively dumber since they're having this UV fact, but the blacks are not so much affected by it, and therefore the gaps should be smaller at the higher UV ones. But in fact, that is not the case. The gap sizes, I believe over here, they're mostly unrelated to the UV, right? These correlations are essentially 0. We can also see another way of doing this is that we can look at the average gap within a county and the average gap between. And what we do, if we get that, we get the average gap on the scholastic test is is 0.787 and it's 0.6 within, which is to say that roughly 70% of the gaps are also found within the same county, which of course means that counties cannot be explaining, and anything that counties relate to, they cannot be just due to that. It must be due to something within counties. And we know from other studies that when you do this sort of thing, even within schools, you'll see that most variation is within schools as well. So it must be something that's even due to smaller units and schools, not just counties. So in terms of conclusions and summary, we have, well, nothing unexpected happened. And that's, of course, from an HBD perspective. We look at the race percentages and they make sense, and we look at the maps and they kind of make sense, and racial variation in the composition of the counties or the schools in this case, they explained most of the variation between counties in the same in the tested ability score. That is not very surprising. That is a 100-year-old conclusion, or probably more, right? Probably genetic variation within race groups explain most of the remaining. As we remember in the within sire models, we don't really get a lot of two good models within. Like the Hispanic one is the best one. It's probably because the different Hispanics. Hispanics is a very heterogeneous group, and maybe the smarter Hispanics were settling in the regions with the whatever. And that's what the model will pick up, and it will pick up on the elevation and longitude, blah, blah. These things will proxy these migrational history of the Hispanics. And apparently here it's negatively related to latitude, despite being positive here. That's, another bizarre finding. Asians, you can probably get something similar. Asians, I think the smarter ones tend to live in California, this sort of area, maybe Washington, and the ones who live elsewhere, I guess, are less bright, less elite. And maybe you get some weird results like that. Also beware, Asian can mean other things than the Chinese. It can mean sometimes it's the Pacific Islander people, and maybe this relates to something with Hawaii. Hawaii was not on the map here, but I believe Hawaii is also in the data set, but I'm not too sure here. The reason we don't plot it is because it will be over here, and it's a bit annoying to map. If we go back to the conclusions, whoops. That was the bonus. And yeah, so we don't really have a measure of this except for one study where we looked at the variation of white ancestry within states, and I didn't find anything. That's probably again because 50 states is not enough to see much variation. You need counties. Climate models, they didn't show much that made a lot of sense here. Sometimes things were in the right direction. Most of the time, I would say they were 0 or close to 0, or quite often in the wrong direction. These are conclusions. I mean, that's just saying what I just said. These results totally don't fit climate models. You should essentially discard them. This is also the largest study ever done on this kind of study, so it's much stronger than a prior study. We also have a bonus here because you may imagine, if we go back, you can see this study was published in the Journal of Geographical Research, where I believe Federico also had published something. And however, we sent it to intelligence because other of this research was sent to intelligence. And so, of course, intelligence is founded by psychologists who want to study intelligence, and they need a journal for it because it has been somewhat difficult to publish elsewhere, and they have all this extra scrutiny, blah blah blah, standard political stuff in psychology. But in a typical institutional takeover, it's become a lot less friendly in recent years. The woke things tends to make like all academics just kind of more left-wing, and I'm sure the left-wing people in intelligence community, say Eric Turkheimer or Kathleen Page, Harden, these kind of people have been pushing this like communism sort of ideology, and that has some effects. And then the media will attack anyone who has the wrong editors, and so I believe that current editor Richard Heyer, he removed a bunch of hereditarians who were open about their beliefs from the institutional review boards. Richard Lynn and I think Gerhard Meisenberg also got removed, and Jan de Neuenhaus. And it's not because these people are lacking in objective measures of scholarly capabilities, right? They have very good publication indexes. It's not because they aren't senior researchers or haven't published in a journal or reviewed for the journals, or it's due to some other reason, which suspiciously was close to the time when some shithead journalist was writing about it. Anyway, So what currently happens is when you submit stuff there and we submit a paper, you get if you get lucky and that they don't just reject you immediately, if you get nice, you get free, say, normal reviewers who know something about your field and what if these reviewers then tend to be positive. If you are lucky, it's mostly like rolling dice, right? You have to get a bunch of high rolls, and you get 2 1s, and that's just 2 reviewers that don't like your paper. Anyway, so what they tend to do is that if you get 3 reviewers, so you're kind of getting close to getting published, they like to add a surprise 4th reviewer that is always negative. And we have some colleagues who tell us the same thing, that they had papers who went close to being accepted, and then surprise, it was 4th reviewer time. And so I don't know exactly who's behind that, but I guess that is up to you to find out. So it's not like intelligence wasn't based in the past tense. Here we had the very first issue of Intelligence had this Arthur Jensen paper, and this is one very curious paper about giving amphetamine to Indian kids and seeing how well they do on tests. That is the kind of thing we used to be able to publish, and now we have 4th reviewer time instead. So in the case of our paper, the timeline goes roughly like this, and we're publishing this kind of information to contribute to sunlight. Since sunlight is the best infectant of corruption, here is some sunlight. It's also very fitting for this talk, since we are talking about climate. So we submit the paper, they get an initial decision, and the initial decision just means the editor looked at it and he decided it wasn't totally scheiße and shit, and so he decided to send it out for review, and then eventually get some review back. You can see getting reviews took 2, almost 3 months, and then you get reviews, and we have this interesting timing here of someone who died, and there was a lot of uproar and the riots and stuff, and suddenly we got added this 4th reviewer, and then we had very strangely had to resubmit it. So I don't know why that is the case, but that happened before. And when you then submit it, and we were supposed to get the same reviewers, except we submitted it and we got some different reviewers who were more like this. And so we have apparently the reviewer thinks we are Leon, and he published in some quite questionable journals, such as the Mankind Waters. Blah, 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 how unbiased it is. Well, mirror, mirror on the wall, race analysis in this. Well, we can tell reviewer here, who is apparently very stupid, is that when you have a regression model and you leave out the most important causal variables, you get this thing called omitted variable bias, and that makes your analysis all fucked up. So you can't really do a regression model where the most important variables are race without race. And I don't know, this seems like stats 101 to me, but Mr. Reviewer here, I guess, didn't think so. And with that said, that concludes this video, and I hope that you liked this, and don't forget and subscribe.